The emerald canopy of Viridia 9 swayed in the warm breeze as the Galactic Preservation Corps ship descended through the atmosphere. Its living hull pulsed and contracted, biolights flickering along organic ridges as it sought the perfect landing spot. Within the transport bay, 6 cadets from across the galaxy stood in formation, their diverse physiologies a testament to the Corps' inclusive mission: preserve life in all its forms throughout the cosmos. Lieutenant Corolla, a towering draconid with scales that shifted between copper and bronze in the ship's ambient lighting, surveyed her squad with narrowed vertical pupils. Her reinforced exosuit hummed quietly, its biometric displays monitoring the planet's atmosphere. She flexed her taloned hands impatiently. "Final equipment check," she barked, her dual-toned voice resonating in the chamber. "This isn't a simulation. Viridia 9 has been designated a Class A sentient ecosystem. The flora here responds to aggression with defensive toxins that can melt through standard-issue exosuits in minutes." Sergeant Pale, an insectoid being with multifaceted eyes and delicate manipulator limbs, chittered excitedly as he ran diagnostics on his suit's nanofabricators. "Fascinating evolutionary adaptation. I've studied the theoretical models, but experiencing a botanically sentient defense system firsthand." His voice trailed off as he noticed Corolla's glare. "Corporal Zinn, an amorphous entity contained within a transparent exosuit filled with bluish liquid, rippled with anticipation. Will our tech interfaces work with the local vegetation? My preliminary scans suggest a silicon-carbon hybrid cellular structure unlike anything in our databases." Corolla tapped her gauntlet, displaying a holographic mission brief. "That's what we're here to learn. 1-week survival exercise. Build shelter using only what Viridia 9 provides. No synthetic materials except your personal suit filters. The instructors will evaluate our adaptability to alien environments where conventional tech might fail." At the back of the formation stood Darnell, the only human in the squad. Unlike his peers, his exosuit was noticeably simpler, lacking the ornate bio-enhancements and weapon hardpoints that decorated the others. In place of a tech array, a small woven sack hung at his hip, containing what appeared to be primitive hand tools. His quiet demeanor had earned him few friends among the cadets, who viewed his minimalist approach as either quaint or dangerously unprepared. "Atmosphere lock disengaging," announced the ship's living consciousness. "Prepare for planetfall." The floor beneath them softened and became transparent, revealing the dense jungle canopy rushing up to meet them. A section of the ship's hull parted like lips, and warm, humid air rich with unfamiliar scents flooded the chamber. The cadets' suits automatically adjusted their filtration systems, analyzing and categorizing the cocktail of alien spores and compounds. They descended on a bioengineered tendril that lowered them gently to the surface. As their boots touched the spongy forest floor, the vegetation around them visibly reacted, leaves curling inward, vines retracting, and luminescent fungal caps dimming their glow. A holographic projection materialized before them. Commander Valux, their training officer, her translucent blue form hovering above a native flower that closed protectively at her virtual presence. "Welcome to Viridia 9, cadets," she said, her voice emanating from their suit communicators. "This planet represents one of our greatest preservation challenges. Its ecosystem doesn't just live, it thinks, communicates, and remembers. Your primary mission is observation and adaptation. Violence against the flora will trigger planetary defense mechanisms that no amount of technology can protect you from." The commander's hologram gestured to the surrounding jungle. "Each of you will establish a shelter at least half a kilometer apart. You have until local sunset to build a structure that will protect you from the elements and native wildlife. Remember, the Corps' mandate is harmony with alien biospheres, not domination." The hologram flickered briefly as a distant rumble shook the ground. "One more thing. Viridia 9 experiences regular seismic events that trigger rapid growth cycles. What you build today may need to adapt to completely different conditions tomorrow. Commander Valex's gaze settled on Darnell. Some of you may find your advanced training less useful than expected. Others might discover that simpler approaches yield surprising results. Begin your preparations now. We'll evaluate your progress at dawn. The hologram dissolved, leaving the cadets alone in the alien forest. Lieutenant Corolla immediately activated her suit's topographical scanner, identifying elevated terrain for strategic advantage. Squad, claim your territories and commence construction. Maintain comm link for emergency situations only. This is an individual assessment. She fixed her gaze on Darnell. Try not to get yourself killed with your traditional methods. The human nodded silently, already studying the pattern of sunlight filtering through the canopy overhead, his fingers gently brushing against a broad leaf that, unlike those around it, leaned toward his touch rather than away from it. The cadets dispersed, each selecting their territory according to their preferred strategies. Corolla sought high ground with clear sightlines. Sergeant Pell gravitated toward a fungal grove that resembled the hive structures of his homeworld. Corporal Zinn flowed toward a rocky outcropping near a stream, where moisture would be abundant. Darnell walked without hurry, seemingly without direction, his gaze constantly shifting between the ground and the canopy above, while the others consulted their suit diagnostics and deployed scanning probes. He knelt frequently to examine soil composition, testing its consistency between his fingers and occasionally bringing it close to his face to smell. After an hour of methodical exploration, he found what he was looking for, a clearing where several different ecosystems converged. To the north, dense forest with broad-leafed plants that caught the sunlight. To the east, a clay-rich bank along a small stream. To the south, tall grasses with flexible but strong fibers. To the west, a stand of fungal growths that emitted a soft bioluminescence. He removed a simple clay working tool from his pouch and began his work. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Corolla had already established her base of operations. Using her suit's enhanced strength, she tore thick vines from the canopy, ignoring their defensive hissing as they released warning pheromones. She wove them into a complex lattice structure, reinforcing weak points with secreted resin that her suit extracted and refined from nearby plants. Primitive, but effective, she muttered to herself, pride evident in her voice as she surveyed the partially completed shelter. Her homeworld's harsh gravity had taught her people that strength and decisiveness were survival traits. She viewed Darnell's methodical approach as wasteful indecision. Yet as she continued working, she noticed the vines she'd harvested earlier were already beginning to sag, their cellular structure deteriorating without connection to the parent plants. The resin, too, was becoming brittle upon exposure to the atmosphere rather than hardening as expected. Adaptive defense mechanism, she growled, recalibrating her approach. She would need to harvest fresher materials and work faster. Her shelter would need to be completed before the plants could deploy their countermeasures. Across the forest, Sergeant Pale was having similar difficulties. His initial strategy had been brilliant. In theory, cultivate a symbiotic relationship with the local fungal colonies, encouraging them to grow into a dome-like structure that would provide both shelter and camouflage. He'd seen similar structures on his homeworld, where massive insect colonies created living architecture in partnership with native fungi. He'd used his suit's biochemical synthesizers to create a growth medium that should have accelerated the fungi's natural expansion. Initially, it had worked beautifully, with the luminescent caps extending and interlocking according to his carefully calculated pattern. But then the humidity shifted as afternoon rain clouds gathered, and the fungal structure suddenly collapsed, releasing a cloud of golden spores that coated his exosuit. Fascinating response to barometric pressure change, he chittered to himself, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his frustration. He scraped a sample of the spores into his suit's analyzer. But problematic for structural integrity, perhaps a hybrid approach. Corporal Zinn was experiencing a different kind of challenge. As an amorphous being, Zinn could temporarily merge with compatible organic matter, sensing its properties from within. This ability made Zin an exceptional analyst, but created unique difficulties when attempting to build permanent structures. Zin had partially absorbed into a fallen log to assess its potential as a foundation element, only to discover that the wood was actually a dormant colony of burrowing organisms that became active upon sensing Zin's presence. The log had literally crawled away, leaving Zin a formless puddle on the forest floor. Perhaps I should reconsider my approach. Zin gurgled, reforming into a humanoid shape within the containment suit. If I cannot adapt the environment to my needs, I must adapt myself to the environment. The day progressed, and the forest grew darker as dense clouds gathered overhead. The first drops of rain hissed as they struck the canopy, carrying trace minerals that made them slightly acidic, not dangerous to the cadets in their protective gear, but a concerning development for their shelters. As lightning illuminated the sky, Commander Valak's voice came through their communicators. First test approaching. Cadets, Viridia 9's rain carries trace amounts of citric acid that will test the integrity of your constructions. Those of you who built wisely will stay dry. The rest will learn a valuable lesson about local adaptation. In her partially completed vine shelter, Corolla growled in frustration as the acid rain began to sizzle against her structure, the carefully woven lattice already beginning to smoke and disintegrate where the raindrops made contact. Sergeant Pell frantically tried to salvage his fungal dome, using his body as a shield against the downpour, but the acid was breaking down the cellular cohesion faster than he could repair it. Corporal Zin, having abandoned conventional shelter building entirely, had found a hollow beneath a massive tree root and had flowed into it, conforming to its shape for protection. And Darnell, what of the human? As the storm intensified, the commander's curiosity got the better of her. She materialized a small observation drone, no larger than a thumb, and sent it to locate the human cadet. The footage it returned surprised even her. Darnell sat cross-legged inside a small but remarkably sound structure. He had created a framework of flexible branches, bent into a dome and secured with plant fiber cordage. But the true ingenuity lay in his covering, broad leaves layered like shingles, each leaf coated with a thin layer of clay on its exposed surface. The acidic rain struck the clay, neutralizing its corrosive properties before it could damage the leaf beneath. Inside, Darnell was dry and calm, sorting more leaves and preparing additional clay mixtures. He had positioned his shelter near a small stream, but elevated enough to avoid flooding. A small vent at the top allowed smoke to escape from a tiny, carefully controlled fire that kept the interior warm and helped cure the clay. Commander Valak smiled. Perhaps this class would learn something valuable after all. The storm lasted through the night. By morning, most of the cadets were in various states of disarray. Lieutenant Corolla had abandoned her dissolved vine shelter and spent the night in her sealed exosuit, conserving power and nursing her wounded pride. Sergeant Pale had managed to create a partial covering of treated fungi that survived the acid, but it housed only his upper body, leaving his lower limbs exposed to the elements. Corporal Zin had fared better, protected by the ancient tree root, but had no proper shelter to speak of. Only Darnell emerged dry and rested, stepping out to collect morning dew from certain leaves that his observations had shown produced sweeter, more purified water. The sun broke through the clouds, and Commander Valak's hologram appeared in a central clearing, summoning the cadets for their first evaluation. They gathered, their conditions telling the story of their night more eloquently than any report could. Corolla's scales were dull with fatigue. Pale's exosuit was stained with fungal residue, and Zin's liquid form swirled with agitated currents. Only Darnell appeared composed, though he kept his eyes downcast, avoiding what he knew would be the resentful gazes of his squad mates. Interesting results, Commander Valak observed, her holographic form walking around each cadet. Lieutenant Corolla, your initial approach showed ambition, but failed to account for the planet's defensive chemistry. Sergeant Pale, Your symbiotic concept was theoretically sound, but required more time to establish than a single day would allow. Corporal Zinn, you adapted yourself rather than adapting your environment, creative but not sustainable for long-term operations. She stopped before Darnell. And you, Cadet, your approach was unexpectedly effective. Perhaps you'd care to explain your methodology to your colleagues? All eyes turned to Darnell, who seemed uncomfortable with the attention. After a moment's hesitation, he spoke, his voice soft but clear. I observed that certain large-leafed plants produce a waxy coating that resists the acid rain. By layering these leaves and adding clay, which is alkaline in nature, I created a surface that neutralizes the acid on contact. He gestured to the surrounding forest. The planet provides everything needed for shelter. We just need to listen to what it's telling us. Lieutenant Corola's scales flushed with an orange hue, a sign of irritation among her species. That's primitive technology. Any first-year cadet could assemble a leaf hut. True advancement comes from enhancing natural materials with our superior technology. Darnell met her gaze steadily. With respect, Lieutenant, sometimes advancement means recognizing when simplicity outperforms complexity. My shelter took 1/10 the energy expenditure of yours and survived the night intact. Before Corolla could respond, a distant rumbling interrupted them, another seismic event, stronger than yesterday's tremor. The ground beneath them shuddered, and from the western forest came a sound like shattering glass, followed by an ethereal light that pulsed through the trees. Right on schedule, Commander Valux noted. Phase 2 of your trial begins now. The quake has awakened the crystal forest. By nightfall, the living crystal trees will have grown to full height. They're beautiful, but dangerous. Their fragments are sharper than any manufactured blade. And during growth phase, they sometimes shed explosively. She looked at each cadet in turn. You have until sunset to either reinforce your existing shelters or build new ones that can withstand crystal shards. This will test your adaptability to changing planetary conditions. The hologram flickered out, leaving the cadets to contemplate this new challenge. Corolla immediately activated her suit's advanced material scanners. I'll analyze the crystal composition and design a counteractive barrier, she announced, already striding toward the glowing forest. Pale's compound eyes reflected the distant light. Perhaps a secondary fungal layer with shock-absorbing properties. Zinn undulated thoughtfully. I could attempt to bond with a crystal fragment to understand its structure. Darnell simply watched the light play through the trees, then quietly returned to his shelter to make modifications. The day progressed, and the crystal forest grew more active. Occasional sharp reports echoed through the jungle as crystal fragments exploded outward from rapidly growing trees. Each time, a shower of razor-sharp shards would follow, slicing through vegetation with frightening ease. Corolla had constructed a new shelter using a combination of dense wood pulp she'd extracted from fallen logs and synthesized resin from her suit's fabricators. The resulting structure resembled a bunker more than a shelter, with thick walls designed to absorb impacts. Pale had cultivated a new fungal dome, this time with multiple layers separated by air pockets that, in theory, would slow incoming projectiles. Zinn had abandoned traditional shelter concepts entirely and had created a pool lined with soft vegetation, where Zinn's amorphous form could submerge completely to avoid flying debris. As sunset approached, the crystal forest reached its zenith. The trees stood like massive prisms, capturing the fading sunlight and fracturing it into spectacular rainbow patterns that danced across the jungle floor. For a moment, the beauty made the cadets forget the danger. Then, as darkness fell, the first tree exploded. The sound was like 1,000 glass chandeliers shattering simultaneously. Crystal shards rocketed in all directions, some no larger than needles, others as long as swords. The air filled with deadly projectiles that sliced through leaves, wood, and fungus with equal ease. In her reinforced bunker, Corolla flinched as the first fragments struck. They penetrated deeper than she'd anticipated, some embedding halfway through her thick walls. A particularly large shard punched completely through, missing her by centimeters and embedding itself in the opposite wall. Structural integrity compromised, her suit's AI warned. Multiple breaches detected. Pale's multi-layered fungal dome fared no better. The crystal shards sliced through the outer layers as if they were mist. Their momentum barely slowed. Only his quick reflexes tempted him as he flattened himself against the ground, the deadly fragments passing just overhead. Zin's liquid pool strategy proved more effective, as the amorphous being could simply flow around any shards that penetrated the water's surface. But it was a passive defense, offering no real shelter, merely survival. And Darnell, the human, had modified his leaf and clay shelter, but not by thickening its walls or adding reinforcement. Instead, he had redesigned it to flex rather than resist. The new structure looked almost flimsy, a dome of interwoven branches covered with overlapping leaves, each leaf now sandwiched between thin layers of clay that had been allowed to dry to a leathery consistency rather than harden completely. When the crystal shards struck Darnell's shelter, something remarkable happened. Instead of penetrating or shattering the structure, they caused the walls to dimple inward. The flexible clay leaf panels absorbed the impact energy, deforming slightly before returning to their original shape. The few shards that did penetrate lost most of their momentum passing through the first layer and were stopped completely by the second. Inside, Darnell sat calmly, listening to the impacts against his shelter with closed eyes, as if counting them or perhaps communing with the planet itself. The crystal storm lasted for hours. By the time it subsided, the night was half gone, and the jungle was transformed. Crystal fragments embedded in trees, earth, and stone glittered under the light of Viridia 9's 3 moons, turning the landscape into a surreal wonderland of refracted light. Corolla's bunker stood partially collapsed, multiple breaches rendering it structurally unsound. The lieutenant herself was unharmed, protected by her exosuit, but her shelter had failed catastrophically. Pale's fungal dome was in tatters, crystal shards having sliced it into ribbons. The insectoid engineer had survived by pressing himself flat against the earth, but his shelter was completely destroyed. Zin's pool strategy had preserved the amorphous being's safety, but provided no actual shelter from the elements or future threats. Only Darnell's simple structure remained intact, its flexible design having weathered the crystal storm with minimal damage. As dawn approached, Corolla made a decision, swallowing her pride. She approached Darnell's shelter. "Cadet," she called, her dual-toned voice carefully controlled. "Request permission to examine your shelter design." Darnell emerged, looking tired but composed. "Of course. Lieutenant, you're welcome to enter." Corolla ducked through the low entrance, her tall frame barely fitting within the modest space. Inside, she was surprised by how comfortable the shelter felt. Warm, dry, with the earthen floor covered in soft grasses that provided natural insulation. Small openings near the top allowed for ventilation while being positioned to prevent rain entry. "Your design withstood the crystal fragments," she stated, running a taloned finger along the interior wall, feeling the flexibility of the material. "Our advanced materials failed, yet this primitive construction survived." Darnell nodded. "It's not about resistance, but resilience. Rigid structures shatter under sufficient force, flexible ones bend and absorb." Corolla's vertical pupils narrowed. "Could you teach this technique to the squad? As commanding officer, I must ensure our collective survival." Before Darnell could respond, there was a chittering sound from outside. Sergeant Pale stood at the entrance, his exosuit damaged and his compound eyes dimmed with exhaustion. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "My shelter has been completely destroyed. May I—" He hesitated, his pride as an engineer clearly wounded. "May I observe your construction methods as well?" Darnell welcomed him inside, and soon Corporal Zinn joined them too, flowing through the entrance in a more compact form before reforming inside. "Most intriguing structure," Zinn gurgled, a tendril of blue liquid extending to touch the wall. "It communicates with the environment rather than opposing it." As the alien cadets examined his shelter, Darnell quietly began preparing a morning meal using edible plants he'd identified the previous day. He heated clay vessels containing water and various botanical ingredients over a small, carefully controlled fire pit in the center of the shelter. "You've been quiet about your background," Corolla observed, accepting a warm cup of fragrant liquid that smelled surprisingly pleasant. "Your personnel file mentioned only that you were raised on a frontier world. What training prepared you for this approach to survival?" Darnell stared into the small fire for a long moment before answering. "I grew up on Terran Outpost 7, a failed colony on the edge of the Cygnus Arm. Our advanced systems collapsed during a solar storm when I was a child. The adult colonists couldn't adapt. They kept trying to rebuild what was lost instead of working with what remained." He looked up, meeting Corolla's gaze. "The native inhabitants, beings your scientific classification would consider primitive, took pity on us surviving children. They taught us to listen to the planet, to see patterns instead of problems. I lived with them for 12 years before the Corps found our colony and evacuated us." Pale's antennae quivered with interest. "Yet you joined the Preservation Corps rather than returning to Earth. Why?" A shadow passed across Darnell's features. "Because I witnessed what happens when advanced civilizations dismiss indigenous knowledge as primitive. 3 years after I left, a corporate terraforming operation began on Outpost 7. They never bothered to study the native ecosystem properly, just classified it as simple and proceeded with atmospheric conversion." He fell silent for a moment, his hands working automatically as he tended the fire. "The microbiome collapsed within weeks. The native population, the people who saved us, they couldn't survive the new atmosphere. Billions of microscopic species extinct in a month. An entire sentient culture gone because someone decided their technology was superior to 1,000,000 years of natural adaptation." The shelter fell silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Even Corolla, normally dismissive of sentiment, seemed affected by the human story. "And that is why you use minimal technology," Zinn observed, liquid form rippling thoughtfully. "It is not inability, but choice." Darnell nodded. "The Corps assigned me to your squad because this mission needs someone who can think beyond technological solutions. Viridia 9 isn't just alive, it's aware. It remembers what we do, how we interact with it. Technology that opposes its natural systems will always fail here, no matter how advanced." Corolla's scales shifted to a deep blue, a sign of contemplation among her species. "You could have explained this at the outset. Would you have believed me?" Darnell asked simply. "Or would you have dismissed it as primitive superstition?" Before she could answer, Commander Vallox's voice came through their communicators. "Attention, cadets! Final evaluation phase beginning. Report to the central clearing immediately." They emerged from Darnell's shelter to find the jungle transformed by the previous night's events. Crystal fragments embedded everywhere glittered in the morning sun, turning the landscape into a dazzling spectacle of refracted light. The ground was littered with sliced vegetation and splintered wood, evidence of the storm's destructive power. In the clearing, Commander Vallox's hologram awaited them, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the 4 cadets, 3 with damaged exosuits and exhausted postures. One human looking remarkably composed, despite his lack of advanced protection. "Interesting developments," she noted. "I see you formed an impromptu coalition." Corolla stepped forward. "Commander, I take full responsibility for the failure of my original shelter design. I've come to recognize that our standard approaches may be suboptimal for this environment." Vallox raised an eyebrow. A surprising admission, Lieutenant. And what alternative do you propose? Corolla gestured to Darnell. Cadet Darnell has demonstrated a more effective methodology. I recommend we adopt a hybrid approach incorporating his techniques. The commander's hologram circled the group, studying each cadet carefully. Sergeant Pale, your assessment? The insectoid engineer's compound eyes flickered as he formulated his response. The human's approach contains elegant simplicity I failed to appreciate initially. My complex fungal matrices proved too fragile for Viridia 9's rapid environmental shifts. I believe we should integrate his organic architectural principles with our technological capabilities. Corporal Zinn, the amorphous being rippled thoughtfully within its containment suit. As a species that must conform rather than construct, I recognize the wisdom in Darnell's philosophy. He does not impose his will upon the environment, but rather aligns with its inherent patterns. This is illuminating. Commander Valux turned finally to Darnell. And you, Cadet, having proven your approach superior, what would you recommend for the squad? Darnell considered his response carefully. With respect, Commander, I haven't proven my approach superior, only different, and perhaps better adapted to this specific environment. Each world requires its own solutions. He gestured to his squad mates. The lieutenant's structural engineering knowledge, Sergeant Pale's understanding of symbiotic relationships, Corporal Zinn's adaptability. These are all valuable. They simply need to be applied in harmony with Viridia 9's nature, not in opposition to it. The commander smiled, the first genuine expression they'd seen from her during the exercise. A diplomatic answer, Cadet. But let me be more specific. Will you instruct your squad mates in your shelter-building technique? The final phase of this exercise requires all of you to construct a single shared shelter that can withstand both acid rain and crystal storms simultaneously. Corolla stepped forward again. Commander, I formally request that Cadet Darnell be appointed technical lead for this operation, with myself as tactical coordinator. The other cadets voiced their agreement, even Pale, whose professional pride had initially been most wounded by the human's success. Darnell looked surprised, then nodded slowly. I'll share what I know, but on one condition. I won't simply tell you what to do. You must learn to see the patterns yourselves. Commander Valux's hologram flickered with approval. You have until sunset. I suggest you begin immediately. The weather indicators show an acid storm front approaching from the east, and seismic readings suggest another crystal growth cycle may occur concurrently. The hologram dissolved, leaving the cadets to their task. They spent the morning scouting for a suitable location, with Darnell guiding them to recognize favorable terrain features and plant species that indicated stable ground and natural drainage. Corolla applied her tactical knowledge to identify defensible positions with multiple escape routes, while Pale analyzed soil samples to determine optimal foundations. By midday, they had selected their site, a gentle rise near the convergence of forest and meadow, with a small stream nearby for water and clay. Zinn proved unexpectedly valuable. The amorphous being's ability to temporarily merge with various plants, allowing them to quickly identify species with the most useful properties. These broad leaves contain natural acid neutralizers, Zinn reported after absorbing into a particularly lush specimen. Their cellular structure produces alkaline compounds when stressed. Darnell nodded. Perfect for the outer layer. Let's gather as many as we can. Corolla, her initial skepticism now replaced with pragmatic focus, organized the collection efforts, establishing efficient gathering routes that minimized damage to the living forest. Pale, meanwhile, had discovered a fungal colony with remarkable properties. These mycelium networks exhibit shock-absorbing characteristics when properly cultivated. They could provide an excellent middle layer between the leaf exterior and the structural frame. Darnell showed them how to harvest materials without triggering the planet's defensive responses. Gentle, respectful gathering that left the core plants intact and able to regenerate. He demonstrated how to process clay to the right consistency, neither too brittle nor too soft, and how to apply it to the leaves in thin, even layers that would flex under impact. Carola contributed her knowledge of load-bearing structures, designing a frame that distributed weight evenly while maintaining flexibility at key stress points. Pell cultivated fungal growths that bonded the structure's elements together with living connections rather than rigid joints. Zinn discovered that by briefly merging with the completed sections, the amorphous being could detect weaknesses invisible to the others, allowing for targeted reinforcement. As the day progressed, their shelter took shape, larger and more sophisticated than Darnell's original design, but following the same fundamental principles of harmony with the environment. The structure resembled a flattened dome with multiple chambers, its exterior covered in overlapping leaf clay panels arranged in a pattern that channeled rainwater away from the entrance while allowing for controlled ventilation. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the eastern horizon, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating their ominous advance. From the west came the now familiar rumbling of seismic activity and the distant glow of crystal trees beginning their growth cycle. Perfect timing, Carola observed grimly as they applied the finishing touches to their shelter. We're about to face both threats simultaneously. They completed their work just as the first acid raindrops began to fall, hissing against vegetation and sending up small plumes of steam where they struck exposed ground. The 4 cadets retreated inside their creation, sealing the specially designed entrance behind them. The interior was surprisingly spacious and comfortable, with separate areas for each cadet's biological needs and a central communal space around a small, controlled fire pit. The translucent leaf panels allowed diffuse light to enter during the day, while the fungal layer provided natural bioluminescence at night. The air inside remained fresh thanks to the living components of the structure, which processed carbon dioxide and released oxygen in a sustainable cycle. As night fell, the dual threat intensified. Acid rain drummed against their shelter, testing the leaf clay panels, while from the west came the sharp reports of exploding crystal trees, followed by the whistling of deadly shards cutting through the air. Inside, the cadets waited tensely, each monitoring the shelter's performance from their perspective of expertise. Carola focused on structural integrity, Pell on the biological responses of their living materials, Zinn on detecting breaches, and Darnell on the overall harmony of their creation with the raging elements outside. The acid rain struck first, sizzling against the outer layer of treated leaves. The alkaline clay neutralized the corrosive compounds on contact, protecting the structure beneath. Occasionally, a particularly strong concentration would eat through the first layer, only to be stopped by the second. Then came the crystal fragments, shooting through the acid rain like glittering missiles. They struck the shelter from all directions, some with enough force to visibly depress the flexible walls, but where Carola's rigid bunker had been penetrated and Pale's fungal dome shredded, their new hybrid structure absorbed the impacts. The leaf clay panels flexed, the fungal middle layer compressed, and the carefully designed frame distributed the force throughout the structure rather than allowing it to concentrate at the point of impact. A particularly massive crystal shard struck near the apex of their shelter, momentarily dimpling the roof inward by several inches. The cadets held their breath, but the structure held, gradually returning to its original shape as the energy dissipated through its living components. Remarkable, Pale chittered, his compound eyes reflecting the bioluminescent glow of the fungal ceiling. The structure is not merely resisting the threats, but actively responding to them. The fungal network is already repairing minor breaches. Zinn flowed to a section of wall, partially merging with it to assess its condition. The leaf clay panels are adapting their chemical composition in response to the acid concentration. They're becoming more alkaline to neutralize the increasing acidity outside. Carola nodded with professional appreciation. The flexible frame is distributing impact forces efficiently. No single point is bearing excessive stress. She turned to Darnell. Your principle of harmony with natural systems has proven tactically sound. The human smiled slightly. It's not my principle. It belongs to this planet, and to countless indigenous cultures throughout the galaxy who learn to listen rather than impose. Through the night, they took turns monitoring their shelter and resting. The storm raged for hours, acid rain and crystal fragments combining into a tempest that would have destroyed any conventional structure. Yet their hybrid creation stood firm, bending but never breaking, absorbing and adapting rather than rigidly opposing the planet's fury. By dawn, the storm had passed. Sunlight filtered through the crystal-strewn jungle, creating rainbow patterns that danced across the landscape. The cadets emerged from their shelter to find a transformed world, glittering, beautiful, and deadly in equal measure. Commander Valex's hologram appeared before them, her expression now openly approving. Impressive work. Cadets, your shelter withstood conditions that have defeated many experienced core units in the past. She walked around their creation, examining it from all angles. A true hybrid approach, advanced engineering principles applied through indigenous methodology. This is precisely the kind of adaptation the Preservation Corps needs for interacting with sentient ecosystems. Corolla stood at attention. Thank you, Commander. The success of this mission belongs to the entire squad, but particularly to Cadet Darnell's insight into working with rather than against planetary systems. Valex nodded. Lieutenant Corolla, your willingness to set aside preconceptions and adapt your leadership approach is noted and commended. She turned to the others. Sergeant Pale, your application of biological knowledge to structural engineering shows promising innovation. Corporal Zinn, your unique perspective as a non-solid being provided critical advantages in this environment. Finally, she addressed Darnell. Cadet, your background and experiences have proven invaluable to this mission. The Corps recruited you specifically for this perspective, though we couldn't be certain how effectively you would communicate it to your squad mates. Darnell looked surprised. You knew about my history with Outpost 7. Of course, Valex replied. Your experience with both advanced technology and indigenous methodologies makes you uniquely qualified for preservation work. This exercise was as much about teaching your squad mates as it was about testing your individual abilities. She addressed the group as a whole. The Galactic Preservation Corps exists at the intersection of advanced science and indigenous wisdom. Too often, spacefaring civilizations dismiss traditional knowledge as primitive or outdated, failing to recognize that such methodologies evolved over millennia in perfect harmony with their environments. Corolla's scales shifted thoughtfully. A balance between innovation and tradition. Precisely, Valex confirmed. The most advanced technology isn't always the most appropriate. True advancement comes from recognizing when to apply complexity and when simplicity serves better. Pale's antennae quivered with excitement. This opens fascinating avenues for my research. Integrating biological systems with traditional methodologies could revolutionize our approach to planetary conservation. Zinn flowed into a more formal posture. As a species that must adapt to environments rather than reshape them, I find this philosophy resonant. Darnell remained quiet, his gaze drawn to the crystal-embedded trees that glittered in the morning light. After a moment, he spoke softly. The question isn't whether technology or tradition is superior. It's whether we're humble enough to recognize that 1,000,000 years of evolution might contain wisdom our few centuries of space travel haven't yet discovered. Commander Valex's hologram smiled. Well said, Cadet. That understanding is at the heart of our mission. She gestured to their shelter. This structure will remain as a case study for future trainees. You've created something that honors both your advanced knowledge and this planet's inherent wisdom. With that, her hologram dissolved, leaving the 4 cadets standing together in the glittering, transformed jungle of Viridia 9. In the days that followed, they continued to refine their shelter, each contributing their unique knowledge and perspective. Carola applied her tactical expertise to improve sight lines and defensive positioning. Pale cultivated symbiotic relationships with local fungi that enhanced the structure's self-repair capabilities. Xin discovered new ways to detect and neutralize environmental threats by temporarily merging with different planetary life forms. And Darnell continued to teach them to listen, not just to hear, but to truly listen to what the living planet was telling them through its patterns and responses. On their final evening on Viridia 9, as they sat together in their shelter watching the 3 moons rise through the translucent ceiling, Carola broke a comfortable silence. "The Coreys will assign us to different units after this training exercise," she said, her normally commanding voice subdued. "But I believe we should request to remain together as a specialized team." Pale chittered agreement. "Our complementary abilities have proven exceptionally effective. It would be inefficient to separate us now that we've established functional protocols." Xin flowed into a pattern that the others had learned, indicated enthusiasm. "I concur. Our collective approach offers unique advantages for interacting with sensitive ecosystems." They looked to Darnell, who had been quietly watching the moonlight play through the crystal fragments embedded in the nearby trees. "Is intelligence measured by complexity?" he asked softly, "or by harmony with life itself?" Carola considered this. "Perhaps true intelligence is knowing which measure applies in each situation." Darnell nodded, a small smile forming. "Then I agree. We should stay together." The next morning, as they prepared for extraction, they stood together on a hillside overlooking the jungle. The rising sun refracted through countless crystal fragments, transforming the canopy into a sea of living light. Their shelter stood in a small clearing, already beginning to integrate with the surrounding ecosystem as vines grew over its outer surface and small creatures made homes in its protected crevices. "In a universe brimming with technology," Darnell said, "this is what it means to live in true partnership with nature, not dominance, not submission, but partnership." Carola placed a taloned hand on his shoulder, a gesture of respect among her people. "A lesson I won't forget. Cadet." Pale's compound eyes reflected the dazzling landscape. Not primitive after all, but profoundly advanced in its simplicity. Xin flowed into a formation that mimicked the shelter's dome. Balance between strength and flexibility, between resisting and yielding. Above them, the living ship descended through the atmosphere, its organic hull pulsing with biolights. But unlike their arrival, the vegetation didn't recoil from its presence. Instead, flowers turned toward it, vines reached upward, and the jungle seemed to welcome them as kin rather than intruders. Viridia 9 had recognized them not as conquerors, but as students who had learned to listen. And in that recognition lay the true success of their mission, not just survival, but harmony with a world that thought, felt, and remembered. As they boarded the ship, Darnell looked back one last time at their cabin of leaves and clay, now glowing in the morning light like a living jewel in the heart of the crystal forest. Not a structure imposed upon the landscape, but a collaboration with it, a small but profound example of what was possible when advanced civilizations remembered the wisdom of simplicity. The ship's hull closed around them like gentle hands, and they ascended into the stars, carrying that wisdom with them to worlds yet unknown.